The cold wind howled through the empty streets as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the quiet neighborhood. Most people had already retreated to the warmth of their homes, unaware of the heartbreaking scene unfolding just beyond their doorsteps. There, on the side of a dimly lit road, a loyal dog stood guard, his eyes filled with worry and determination. His owner lay motionless beside him, injured and unable to move, but the faithful companion refused to leave his side. Passers-by hurried along, sparing only a glance, uncertain whether to intervene. Cars slowed but moved on, assuming help was on the way. But no one stopped until a pair of rescuers noticed something unusual. Despite the chaos around them, the dog remained rooted in place, his body tense, his gaze never wavering. Every time someone tried to come closer, he would let out a low whimper, torn between fear and the instinct to protect the one he loved most. What had happened? Who was this person lying there, and why was this dog so fiercely devoted? As the rescuers inched closer, they realized they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would change the course of this night forever. One of the rescuers, a woman with a warm but determined expression, took a cautious step forward, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. The dog, a scruffy shepherd mix with fur, matted from the damp night air, let out a soft but urgent growl. His body was tense, his stance unwavering, as if he understood the weight of this moment more than anyone else. His eyes flickered between the stranger and the unmoving form of his owner, torn between trust and duty. The second rescuer, a man in his late 30s with a quiet patience, knelt a few feet away. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, his voice steady but gentle. "We're here to help." The dog's ears flicked at the words, but he didn't move. The woman pulled out her phone, dialing for emergency services while her partner tried to ease the dog's tension. The man on the ground was breathing, though shallowly. A faint smear of blood stained the pavement beneath his head, but in the dim light, it was difficult to tell how severe the injury was. The dog, however, had not left his side, not for food, not for warmth, not for anything. The seconds stretched into minutes. The dog's muscles quivered from exhaustion, but he stayed firm. Something about his devotion struck deep in the rescuers' hearts. A few onlookers had begun to gather now, drawn by the hushed urgency in the rescuers' voices. Some held their phones up, recording the standoff between the determined dog and the strangers trying to intervene. The world, as it often did, wanted to capture the moment before deciding whether to help. Then, in the distance, sirens wailed. The dog's ears perked up, his body tensing even further. Would these new arrivals be friends or another threat? The ambulance pulled up, its lights flashing, and the paramedics hurried out. The rescuers exchanged quick words with them, explaining the situation. But as the paramedics moved closer, the dog let out a sharp bark, his tail low, his body placing itself firmly between his owner and the unknown hands reaching toward him. A paramedic, accustomed to the unpredictable nature of emergencies, kept his voice calm. "We need to move him now. If we don't, he may not make it." But the dog didn't understand. All he saw were strangers trying to take his person away. One of the rescuers had an idea. Slowly, she crouched down and placed a hand on the ground, mirroring the dog's position. "He's scared," she said softly. "He doesn't know we're helping. But look at him, he's exhausted. He's been standing here for who knows how long. He's afraid if he moves, something worse will happen." The tension in the air was thick. Would the dog finally let them through? A moment passed. Then another. And then, just as the paramedics inched forward, something happened that no one expected. The dog, trembling from fatigue, took a slow, deliberate step toward the rescuer. His eyes, still filled with uncertainty, met hers. It wasn't trust. Not yet, but it was something close. Just as hope filled the air, a sudden movement shattered the fragile moment. The injured man on the ground let out a weak, painful groan. His fingers twitched against the pavement. The dog whipped around, his momentary hesitation vanishing. He let out a sharp, protective bark, lowering his body as if ready to defend his owner with the last bit of energy he had left. The paramedics hesitated, and the onlookers held their breath, because now everything had changed. The man was alive, barely conscious, and in desperate need of help. But his dog still wasn't ready to let anyone near. And with time running out, the rescuers had one final chance to earn the trust of the animal, who had already proven he would do anything to protect the one he loved. The moments stretched, heavy with uncertainty. The dog's body was still rigid, his protective instincts holding strong even as his exhaustion threatened to collapse him. His owner stirred again, a weak groan escaping his lips, but his eyes remained shut. The paramedics glanced at each other, silently communicating the urgency of the situation. Every second counted, and yet they were at the mercy of a dog's unwavering love. The woman who had been crouched closest to the dog made a decision. Slowly, she pulled off her jacket and placed it gently on the ground between them, inching forward just enough to make her presence known without being a threat. "You're a good boy," she murmured, her voice warm but steady. "You've done so well. He's still here because of you." The dog's ears flicked at her voice, his gaze darting from her to his owner. His breathing was quick and shallow, but he didn't move away this time. The man beside her reached into his pocket, retrieving a small treat. It wasn't much, just something left over from another rescue earlier that day, but it might be enough. He extended it carefully, placing it on the ground rather than offering it directly. The dog's nostrils flared, and for a split second, hunger flickered in his eyes. How long had it been since he'd eaten? Since he'd had water? The devotion that kept him standing was now the very thing draining him of the strength he so desperately needed. The paramedics took the smallest of steps forward. The dog growled, low but wary. He didn't trust them yet. But then something changed. The injured man exhaled a shaky breath, his lips parting as he struggled to speak. It was barely a whisper, a sound more fragile than air. "Buddy!" At the sound of his owner's voice, the dog's entire body shifted. His ears perked, his tail trembled, and his eyes locked onto the man. He whimpered, torn between standing his ground and responding to the voice he'd been waiting for. The woman took the opportunity to inch closer. "He needs help," she said softly, her hand resting just beside the dog's paw. "And so do you." The dog hesitated, his muscles quivering with the weight of indecision. But then, slowly, ever so slowly, he lowered his body to the ground. His tail gave a single, hesitant wag, and then another. The tension in his frame eased, not entirely, but just enough. That was all the paramedics needed. In an instant, they moved forward, working quickly to assess the man's condition. His injuries were serious, but he was stable enough to transport. The woman who had been crouched beside the dog reached out carefully, her fingers brushing against his fur. He flinched but didn't pull away. It was progress. As the paramedics lifted the man onto a stretcher, the dog scrambled to his feet, his panic flaring again. He let out a sharp bark, his eyes darting between the rescuers and his owner. Was he being taken away? Would he come back? The fear in the dog's gaze was unmistakable. The man, barely conscious, turned his head ever so slightly. His lips parted, his voice weak but determined. "He stays with me." One of the paramedics glanced at his partner before nodding. "All right, He comes with us." The dog didn't need to be told twice. As the stretcher was wheeled toward the ambulance, he trotted beside it, his body still weary, but his resolve stronger than ever. He would not leave his owner. Not now. Not ever. The rescuers exchanged glances, a quiet relief settling between them. They had seen many things in their time, but rarely did they witness a love this pure, this unbreakable. As the ambulance doors closed, the dog sat at his owner's feet, his eyes never leaving the man's face. The vehicle pulled away, the lights flashing in the darkened streets, and just like that, they were gone. The onlookers who had gathered slowly began to disperse, their murmurs fading into the night. Some had captured the moment on their phones, likely to be shared with the world in awe of the dog's loyalty. But for those who had witnessed it in person, the impact ran deeper. It was a reminder of devotion, of resilience, of the bond that even time and pain could not break. Days later, the story had spread like wildfire. News outlets picked it up, headlines marveling at the dog who refused to leave his injured owner's side. People from all over the world were moved by the tale, their hearts stirred by the unwavering loyalty of a single animal. In the hospital, the man slowly regained consciousness, his body battered but healing. And at his bedside, curled up on a blanket the nurses had provided, was his dog. He never left. Not when the doctors came in, not when the machines beeped and hummed around them. He remained just as he always had, just as he always would. When the man finally found the strength to lift his hand, he rested it gently on the dog's head, his fingers brushing against the scruffy fur. The dog leaned into the touch, his tail giving a slow, steady wag. "You saved me, buddy," the man whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "You always do." The dog let out a soft huff, as if he understood. And maybe, just maybe, he did. Outside the hospital, people continued to talk about the story. About the loyalty of a dog who refused to abandon the one he loved. About the rescuers who saw past the fear and reached for trust instead. About how, in a world often rushing past, sometimes all it takes is one moment to remind us of what truly matters. As for the dog and his owner, their journey wasn't over. There would be recovery, challenges to face, and new hurdles to overcome. But no matter what came next, one thing was certain: whatever they faced, they would face it together.